Hello everyone, and welcome to Midnight Echoes. This video is meant to help you relax, unwind, and maybe drift off to sleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. So feel free to share in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the episodes. I moved into the city to escape the monotony of small-town life. My apartment building wasn't glamorous. Chipped paint, creaky stairs, but it was cheap and close to work. I didn't care about the neighbors, except for the one in 3B. No one ever saw them, but people whispered about strange noises coming from their apartment late at night. My first encounter with 3B was subtle. I was taking out the trash one night when I heard a soft shuffle behind me. Turning, I saw a shadow dart across the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, but no one responded. The air felt heavier, colder. I told myself it was just my imagination and went back inside. A few weeks later, I started noticing things. My doormat was shifted, my mail was out of order, and once I found a single black feather on my windowsill. I laughed it off as coincidences, but my laughter stopped when I heard the scratching. It came from 3B. It was faint, irregular, like someone was dragging their nails down the walls. The scratching became a nightly occurrence, starting around midnight and lasting for hours. I asked my neighbors about it, but they just shrugged. "That's just 3B, an older woman said, lowering her voice. "Don't bother them. They don't like being disturbed." Her warning sent a chill through me, but I decided to ignore it. One night, the scratching stopped, replaced by a soft tapping on the wall that separated my bedroom from 3B. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow, deliberate. My skin prickled as I pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping stopped instantly, as if they knew I was listening. I backed away, my heart racing. Curiosity got the better of me. The next morning, I knocked on 3B's door. The hallway was silent except for the hum of a distant radiator. I knocked again, louder this time. No answer. I leaned in, trying to hear any movement inside. The door creaked open slightly, but the apartment beyond was dark and still. I didn't dare go in. I told myself to leave it alone, but the mysteries of 3B consumed me. I asked the landlord about them. "They've been here a long time," he said vaguely. "Pay on time. Keep to themselves. That's all I know." His indifference frustrated me. How could someone be so secretive, yet so unsettlingly present? That night, the tapping returned, louder and more erratic. It felt like a message, but I couldn't understand it. My fear turned to anger. I banged on the wall, shouting, "Cut it out!" The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then came the reply. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. My blood ran cold. I stared at the door, not daring to move. "Who's there?" I whispered. No response. The knocking didn't come again, but the sense of being watched lingered. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "Keep quiet." My hands trembled as I read it. Was this a warning? A threat? I decided to install a camera in the hallway, pointed directly at my door. I needed to know who was messing with me. The camera picked up nothing unusual for the first few nights. Then, around 3/4 night, I saw it. A figure standing just outside my door, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. They stood there for nearly 10 minutes before retreating into 3B. I saved the footage and called the police. The officers were polite but skeptical. "No crime has been committed," one of them said. "They didn't break in or threaten you." I showed them the footage, but they dismissed it as someone playing a prank. "If it happens again, call us," they said. Their indifference made my stomach churn. The tapping stopped for a few days, but my unease didn't fade. One morning, I found my front door unlocked. I knew I had locked it the night before. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I checked the hallway camera footage, but saw no one. I decided to confront 3B directly. I knocked on their door again, louder this time. The silence on the other side was suffocating. Finally, I shouted, "I know what you're doing. Leave me alone." The door opened just a crack. A pale hand emerged, holding a piece of paper. I froze as they dropped it on the floor and shut the door. The paper had 2 words scrawled on it: "Stay quiet." My breath caught in my throat. What did they mean? What were they hiding? I debated calling the police again, but without concrete evidence, I knew they wouldn't help. I decided to monitor the hallway even more closely. That night, I reviewed the camera footage from the previous day. My stomach dropped as I saw something I hadn't noticed before: the figure from 3B, standing outside my door in the early hours of the morning. They were holding what looked like a knife, their face obscured by the poor lighting. I called the landlord, demanding he do something about 3B. "Look, I've told you before, they pay on time," he said, exasperated. "I'm not evicting someone because you're scared of them." His refusal left me feeling helpless. That night, I slept with a chair braced against my door and a knife under my pillow. At 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint whispering. It was coming from the vent in my bedroom, the one that connected to 3B. I pressed my ear to it, trying to make out the words. It was a man's voice, low and raspy, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They're listening. They're listening." The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by heavy breathing. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the vent. Then, a loud thud echoed through the wall, as if something heavy had been thrown. I grabbed my phone and started dialing the police, but before I could hit call, the thudding stopped. The next morning, I found another note under my door. This one read, "Stop looking." I packed the bag and left the building, checking into a motel across town. I couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was happening in 3B, I wanted no part of it. Even at the motel, I couldn't escape the paranoia. Every knock on the door or creak of the floorboards made my heart race. I decided to return to the building the next day to collect my things and leave for good. But when I arrived, something was off. The hallway felt darker, quieter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When I reached my apartment, I found the door ajar. Inside, the place was in shambles. Drawers were pulled out, furniture overturned. The camera I had set up was smashed to pieces. On the wall, scrawled in black marker, were the words, "You were warned." My blood turned to ice. I rushed out of the building, leaving everything behind. I reported the break-in to the police, but by the time they arrived, the writing on the wall was gone. My apartment was spotless, as if nothing had happened. I knew 3B was responsible, but there was no way to prove it. The police spoke to 3B, but they claimed ignorance. "I don't bother anyone," they said. The officers seemed satisfied and left, but I knew better. 3B was dangerous. I canceled my lease and moved out the next day, determined to start over somewhere far away. Weeks later, I received a package at my new address. It had no return label. Inside was my smashed camera and a single piece of paper. Written on it were 3 words: "We're still watching." Next story. The morning sunlight spilled over the quiet streets of Crescent, a small town nestled in the mountains. It was my first time here, a stopover on a solo cross-country road trip. My plan was simple: rest, explore the quaint town, and leave before dusk. The place felt welcoming at first glance. Rows of pastel houses with cheerful gardens lined the streets, and I couldn't imagine anything sinister lurking in such a picturesque setting. I parked my car near a diner called Millie's Grub. The The kind of place that had hand-painted signs advertising world's best pancakes. Inside, it smelled like bacon grease and brewed coffee. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, recommended the breakfast special. I settled into a corner booth, savoring the comfort food. That was when I noticed the man sitting at the counter, staring. His intense, unblinking gaze bore into me. He was in his 40s, with sun-weathered skin and a wiry frame. His clothes were mismatched, and his hands fidgeted with a coffee cup. I tried to ignore him, but his scrutiny was unnerving. When our eyes finally met, he smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was sharp and thin, like a blade. I quickly finished my meal, leaving a generous tip, and stepped outside. A gust of wind swept through the street, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. Back in my car, I decided to drive to a nearby trailhead for a short hike. The mountains loomed invitingly, and I needed to shake off the unease from the diner. As I turned the ignition, I noticed the man from the diner standing at the window. He didn't say a word. He just watched me, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying an exhibit. I hit the gas, driving off quickly, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The trailhead was deserted. Thick trees stretched endlessly, their shadows crisscrossing the dirt path. Hiking usually calmed me, but today, the air felt charged. Every crack of a twig made me spin around. It was irrational, I told myself. The man from the diner was just strange, not a threat. Still, I couldn't shake the image of his smile. I pushed further up the trail, determined to make it to the scenic overlook marked on the map. The overlook was breathtaking, a sweeping view of the valley below, dotted with houses and the winding river. I sat on a boulder, letting the wind whip through my hair. For a moment, I felt at peace. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching the gravel path behind me. My stomach clenched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No response. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel eyes on me. I stood and scanned the trees. Nothing moved except the branches swaying in the wind. The rational part of me insisted it was another hiker, but the silence that followed was suffocating. I hurried back down the trail, my heart pounding. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. Relief flooded me as I climbed in and locked the doors. Driving back to town, I tried to shake off the paranoia. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the streets were quieter than before. As I parked outside the motel, I saw the man again. He stood on the opposite sidewalk, leaning against a lamppost, smoking. He nodded at me as if we were old friends. I forced a smile and went inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were trembling as I pulled the curtains shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside made me jump. Around 2 a.m, I heard a faint tapping on the window. My chest tightened. I lay frozen in bed, straining to hear. The tapping came again, soft and deliberate. Gathering my courage, I peeked through the curtains. The man was there, standing just outside, his face lit by the flickering neon motel sign. I backed away, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I shouted through the glass. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed his hand against the window, smearing something dark and sticky. Blood. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The signal was dead. I was trapped, alone, and the man was still outside. Panic gripped me as I realized I had no idea how far he was willing to go. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a lamp, and clutched it tightly, my knuckles whitening. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. When I finally peeked out again, the man was gone. A smear of blood was all that remained on the window. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lamp in my lap, my back against the wall, waiting for dawn. At first light, I decided to leave town immediately. I threw my things into my bag, barely stopping to check the mirror. I looked like a ghost, pale and sleep-deprived. As I loaded my suitcase into the car, I scanned the street. It was empty. The town felt deserted, eerily still. I told myself the man had moved on, that this was all some sick coincidence. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Driving down the mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The twists and turns made it hard to see if anyone was following me. About an hour out of town, I stopped at a gas station. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time, with faded signs and a rusted pump. As I filled the tank, I asked the attendant if they had seen anyone fitting the man's description. The attendant frowned. "We don't get many strangers out this way," he said, his tone cautious. I described the man again, mentioning the blood on my motel window. The attendant's face darkened. "You need to be careful," he warned. "There have been stories. People disappearing in those mountains. Always starts with someone odd hanging around." My stomach dropped. I paid quickly and got back in the car, eager to put more distance between me and Crescent. The next few hours passed uneventfully. The highway stretched on, flanked by endless trees. I started to relax, telling myself it was over. But as I approached a rest stop, my heart sank. A familiar figure was leaning against a picnic table. It was him. He looked up as my car slowed, locking eyes with me. The same predatory smile spread across his face. I floored the gas pedal, speeding past him. Panic surged through me. How had he gotten here? There was no way he could have followed me on foot. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I drove for hours without stopping, the gas gauge nearing empty. Finally, I spotted a larger town on the horizon. I checked into a chain hotel, confident that its security cameras and staffed lobby would keep me safe. That night, I double-locked the door and slid a chair under the handle for good measure. Exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of muffled laughter. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the adjacent rooms. It was inside my room. My breath caught as I scanned the shadows, the laughter growing louder. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence. I fumbled for the lamp and switched it on. The room was empty. My heart thundered in my chest as I checked every corner under the bed, inside the closet. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress had finally gotten to me. But when I turned back to the bed, I saw it. A message scrolled on the mirror in what looked like blood. "You can't run." Terror consumed me. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk, begging them to send someone up. A few minutes later, a hotel employee arrived, but the message was gone. The mirror was spotless, as if nothing had ever been there. They gave me a sympathetic look, probably thinking I was some paranoid traveler. I didn't care. I knew what I had seen. I packed my things and left the hotel before sunrise. Driving aimlessly, I felt like prey. Every shadow on the road seemed to take his shape. I didn't know where to go or what to do. Stopping felt dangerous, but so did continuing. My mind raced with memories of every horror story I'd ever heard. And then I spotted it at a police station. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot. I needed help. I needed someone to believe me. Inside the station, I explained everything to the officer on duty. He listened intently, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "You've been through a lot," he said, his tone measured. "But without evidence, there's not much we can do." He offered to let me rest in the waiting area until I felt safe to leave. It wasn't ideal, but at least I wasn't alone anymore. I sat in the brightly lit waiting area, surrounded by the sterile smell of the station. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of safety. But as I glanced at the glass door leading outside, my stomach dropped. He was there, standing under a flickering street lamp. His smile was gone, replaced by an expression of cold, calculated fury. He raised a hand, mimicking a knife slicing across his throat. I jumped to my feet, shouting for the officer. By the time he came to the door, the man had vanished. "I swear he was just there," I said, my voice shaking. The officer frowned, glancing outside. "We'll keep an eye out," he assured me. But I could tell he didn't believe me. He suggested I file a formal report and find somewhere else to stay. I felt the walls closing in around me. Reluctantly, I left the station, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I couldn't drive far. Exhaustion was clouding my judgment. I found another motel just off the highway. This one even more run down than the last. Locking myself inside, I pushed a dresser against the door. Sleep was impossible. I sat on the bed, clutching a pocket knife I'd bought at a gas station earlier that day. At some point, fatigue overtook me. I woke to a faint sound breathing. It wasn't mine. My blood ran cold as I opened my eyes to see the man sitting in the chair across the room. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was blank, almost bored, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I can," he said simply, his voice low and calm. That was the last thing I heard before everything erupted into chaos. I lunged for the door, throwing the dresser aside. He was faster than I expected, grabbing my arm, his grip like iron. I slashed blindly with the pocket knife, catching his arm. He howled, the sound animalistic, and released me. I didn't look back as I sprinted out of the room, the knife still clutched in my hand. The motel hallway was empty, the fluorescents flickering overhead. I burst into the parking lot, fumbling with my car keys. My hands were slick with sweat, making it nearly impossible to unlock the door. Behind me, I heard the motel door slam open. He was coming. Adrenaline surged as I finally got the door open and dove inside. The tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing in the middle of the road, blood dripping from his arm. His figure grew smaller as I drove faster, the darkness swallowing him. I didn't stop until I reached a bustling rest stop hours later. Among the crowd of travelers, I finally felt a shred of safety. I sat in my car for a long time, shaking uncontrollably. The man's words echoed in my mind, "Because I can." It wasn't personal to him. It was a game, one he played simply because he enjoyed it. The realization chilled me to the bone. I didn't report the incident to the police again. What could I say? They'd dismiss it as hysteria, or worse, a fabrication. I knew the truth, and that was enough. Weeks passed before I finally felt safe again. I returned home, installed new locks, and refused to travel alone. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching. The world hasn't felt the same since Crescent. Sometimes I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see his face. I survived, but he took something from me. And I know, deep down, he'll always be waiting. Next story. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I'd found a slice of suburban heaven. My house was small but cozy, nestled on a quiet street. The neighbors were friendly in passing, and everything seemed perfect. Harold, who lived next door, was the most noticeable. He was always outside, tending to his pristine garden. He seemed nice, if a bit overly curious. Harold introduced himself on my first day. He offered a firm handshake and a wide smile. "If you ever need anything, just let me know," he said. At first, I appreciated his kindness. He gave me advice on local stores and recommended a handyman for small fixes. I assumed he was just being neighborly, but his friendliness soon began to feel overbearing. It started with small things. Harold would appear every time I came home, waving from his garden or pretending to check the mailbox. He would ask detailed questions about my job, my schedule, and even my family. "You live alone, right?" he asked one evening. I nodded hesitantly, and his smile widened. "Must be peaceful," he said, almost wistfully. One night, I found a plate of cookies on my porch with a note, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Harold." I didn't think much of it, but when I mentioned it to a colleague at work, she raised an eyebrow. "That's kind of weird," she said. "You barely know the guy." I shrugged it off, though something about Harold's smile lingered in my mind. Things escalated when I came home late one evening. Harold was waiting in his driveway, standing unnervingly still. "You're out late," he commented as I stepped out of my car. His tone was casual, but the implication felt off. I laughed awkwardly, muttered something about errands, and hurried inside. Through the blinds, I could see him standing there, watching. The next morning, Harold knocked on my door. He held a gardening trowel in one hand and a bag of tomatoes in the other. "Thought you might like some fresh produce," he said, smiling. I thanked him and took the bag, but the interaction left me unsettled. His gaze lingered too long, as though he was studying me. I decided to avoid him whenever possible. A week later, I noticed something strange. My garden hose, which I always coiled neatly, was stretched across the yard. The gate, usually locked, was ajar. I assumed an animal had wandered in, but then I saw footprints in the dirt, large, boot-shaped prints leading toward my shed. I glanced toward Harold's yard. He was there, trimming his hedges, whistling. That night, I installed a motion-activated camera near the back door. I didn't tell anyone, not even Harold, who waved at me the next morning with a grin. "Getting into gardening yourself?" he joked, nodding toward the camera. I froze. How had he noticed? The camera was discreet, tucked under the eaves. His comment seemed harmless, but it sent a chill down my spine. The footage from the first night showed nothing unusual. But the second night, at 2:45 a.m., the camera picked up movement. A figure walked across my yard, heading toward the shed. The angle made it hard to see their face, but the build was unmistakable. It was Harold. He stood near the shed for several minutes before disappearing out of frame. I confronted Harold the next day. "Were you in my yard last night?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. His expression didn't waver. "Why would I do that?" he replied, his voice light. "You must have imagined it." I wanted to press further, but his calm demeanor made me second-guess myself. Still, I started locking my doors and windows obsessively. The next time I checked the camera footage, my blood ran cold. At 3:10 a.m., Harold appeared again. This time, he wasn't near the shed. He was at the back door, staring directly at the camera. His face was eerily blank, devoid of emotion. He stood there for nearly 5 minutes before walking away. I saved the footage and called the police. When the officers arrived, I showed them the footage. They seemed concerned but explained that Harold hadn't technically done anything illegal. "We'll have a talk with him," one of them said. I watched from the window as they spoke to Harold in his driveway. He nodded along, his face a mask of innocence. After they left, he glanced at my house and smiled. Harold's behavior became more brazen. He began leaving things on my porch: flowers, tools, even a photograph of my house taken from an angle I didn't recognize. I stopped going outside unless I had to. I kept my blinds closed and avoided answering the door. Despite my precautions, I felt his presence constantly, like he was watching from the shadows. One evening, I heard a loud bang from the backyard. I grabbed a flashlight and peeked out. The shed door was wide open, swinging in the wind. As I approached, the flashlight beam caught something glinting inside. It was a pair of garden shears, dripping with what looked like blood. My stomach churned as I backed away, my mind racing with possibilities. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the shears were gone. The shed was empty, save for my tools. Harold stood in his yard, watching the commotion with a bemused expression. "Trouble again?" he called out, feigning concern. The officers took a report, but left with little else to go on. I felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare. Over the next few nights, the camera captured nothing. I began to think Harold had finally backed off until I woke up to find my car tires slashed. The cuts were clean, deliberate. I checked the camera footage, but it had been disabled somehow. A lump formed in my throat as I realized Harold was escalating. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. I stayed awake that night, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. Around 4 a.m, I heard a faint tapping on the window. My breath hitched as I crept toward the sound. Harold's face was there, inches from the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. I screamed, and he disappeared into the darkness. When the police arrived, there was no sign of him. The officers warned Harold to stay away, but his behavior only grew more unhinged. He began pacing the sidewalk in front of my house, muttering to himself. One night, he shouted my name repeatedly, his voice hoarse and desperate. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. I started looking for a new place to live. The final straw came 2 nights later. I woke to the sound of glass shattering. Someone had thrown a rock through my living room window. Attached to it was a note: "You can't run." I didn't wait for the police. I packed a bag and drove to a hotel, leaving everything else behind. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning, I broke my lease and moved in with a friend temporarily. Harold's smile haunted me in my dreams, his face always lurking in the corners of my mind. Even now, in a new city, I double-check every lock and glance over my shoulder constantly. I survived, but Harold took something from me that I'll never get back: my sense of safety. A few weeks passed in my new location, and I began to feel a faint sense of peace. The nightmares came less often, and I started sleeping through the night. But one evening, as I was walking home from the corner store, I noticed something chilling. A familiar face in a car parked across the street. Harold was watching me, his expression calm and unwavering. Panic surged through me, and I rushed back to my new apartment. I locked the door, checked every window, and called my friend. She told me I was imagining things, but I knew better. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Every time I left the apartment, I felt his eyes on me, though I couldn't prove it. The next night, I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line was blank, but the message contained a single image: my new apartment building, taken from the parking lot. My stomach twisted as I realized the photo had been taken just hours earlier. I called the police, but they couldn't trace the email. Once again, Harold had found a way to stay one step ahead. I decided to set up more cameras, this time placing them inside my apartment as well. I stayed up that night, watching the live feeds from every angle. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement on one of the cameras, the hallway outside my door. Harold was there, standing motionless. He stared at the door for several minutes before disappearing into the stairwell. I spent the next day searching for a more permanent solution. I contacted a private security firm, explaining my situation. They suggested reinforced doors and additional alarms, which I agreed to install. The measures gave me some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Harold would find a way around them. He always did. Despite the security upgrades, the harassment continued. I found another note taped to my door. "You can't hide." My chest tightened as I read the words, each one feeling like a knife to my sanity. I reported it to the police again, but without physical evidence, there was nothing they could do. I felt trapped, like a caged animal waiting for the inevitable. The final confrontation came a week later. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my front door handle rattling. My heart pounded as I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept toward the door. The security alarm blared, but the rattling didn't stop. I screamed, hoping to scare him off, and finally heard footsteps retreating down the hall. The police arrived within minutes, but Harold was gone. They found a crowbar outside the door, along with scuff marks on the frame. The officer assured me they'd do everything they could to find him, but I knew better. Harold wasn't going to stop. As long as he was out there, I would never be free. I packed my belongings that night and left the city for good. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my closest friends. I changed my phone number, deleted my social media, and moved to a town where no one knew me. The isolation was suffocating, but it was the only way I could feel safe. Months later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. My blood ran cold as I opened it. Inside was a photograph of my new house, taken from the street. Written on the back were 3 words, "Found you again." My hands trembled as I stared at the photo, realizing that no matter where I went, Harold would always follow. Next story. The open road stretched endlessly before me, the horizon shimmering in the late summer heat. I had been driving for hours, the monotony broken only by the crackling of the car's radio. I was halfway through a long drive to visit an old college friend in Colorado, taking a less traveled route to avoid the congestion of the interstate. The isolation was both freeing and unnerving. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. I spotted a figure up ahead, walking along the shoulder of the road. A hitchhiker. He carried a small backpack and wore a dark jacket despite the heat. As I approached, his head turned slightly, as if he sensed my car before hearing it. His face was pale, his features sharp and angular. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. I rolled down the passenger side window as he approached. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded, his expression neutral. "Thanks," he said, his voice calm and measured. There was something unsettling about his tone, but I pushed the thought aside. He climbed in, setting his backpack at his feet. As I pulled back onto the road, I noticed his hands scarred and calloused, as if he had lived a hard life. For the first few miles, he was quiet, staring out the window. I made small talk, trying to ease the tension. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Wherever you're going," he replied, not looking at me. The response was ambiguous enough to put me on edge. I glanced at him briefly. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence grew heavier with each passing mile. I regretted picking him up, but I didn't know how to get rid of him without being rude. My unease deepened when he reached for the radio and turned it off without asking. "I prefer the quiet," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the daylight fading into a fiery dusk. Every moment with him in the car felt like a test of endurance. The hitchhiker finally spoke again. "You shouldn't trust strangers," he said, his tone casual but cutting. I forced a laugh. "Maybe not, but you seemed harmless enough." He turned to face me for the first time, his expression unsettlingly blank. Looks can be deceiving. My chest tightened. Was he joking, or was there a deeper meaning to his words? I focused on the road, every instinct screaming at me to end this ride. As night fell, he grew more talkative, though his words offered little comfort. He asked pointed questions about my life, my destination, and whether anyone knew I was traveling. His curiosity felt intrusive, almost predatory. "You know," he said, "some people just vanish out here. It's so isolated." "No one would hear you scream." My pulse quickened. "That's unsettling," I replied, trying to mask my fear with forced nonchalance. The tension in the car was unbearable. I needed an excuse to stop and make him leave. "I need to use the restroom," I lied, pulling into a dimly lit gas station. The place looked abandoned, the sign flickering weakly. I parked, grabbing my phone and keys. "Stay here. I'll be quick," I said, hoping he wouldn't follow. He nodded, his face unreadable. As I walked inside, I glanced back. He was watching me. Inside, the gas station was eerily silent. The shelves were half-stocked, and the air smelled stale. I approached the counter, relieved to see a clerk. "Can you call the police?" I whispered, explaining my situation. The clerk frowned but nodded, picking up the phone. When I returned to the car, the hitchhiker was gone. His backpack remained, slumped against the passenger seat. My relief was short-lived when I noticed something alarming. On the dashboard was a knife, its blade smeared with something dark. My breath caught. Was it blood? I looked around the lot, but he was nowhere to be seen. Panic surged through me. I jumped into the driver's seat and sped off, leaving his backpack and the gas station behind. My mind raced with questions. Had he left it as a warning, or was this some cruel joke? Either way, I wasn't staying to find out. The highway stretched on in oppressive darkness, the headlights carving a narrow path through the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still near, watching me from the shadows. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him in the back seat. The knife on the dashboard haunted me. Why had he left it behind? What had he planned to do with it? About 20 miles down the road, I spotted flashing lights in the distance. A police car was parked on the shoulder, its officer speaking to someone standing by a truck. Relief flooded me as I pulled over. I quickly explained the situation, showing the knife as proof. The officer frowned, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "We'll look into it," he promised, though his tone was less reassuring than I'd hoped. The officer ran my license and advised me to stay in a nearby town for the night. "You don't want to be out here alone," he said, his words carrying an ominous weight. I agreed, though the idea of staying anywhere unfamiliar made my skin crawl. As I drove off, I couldn't help but feel like the danger wasn't over. The hitchhiker had vanished too easily, leaving too many questions unanswered. I reached the small town of Redstone just before midnight. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The streets were deserted, and most of the buildings looked closed for the night. I found a motel with a flickering vacancy sign and checked in. The clerk barely looked up as he handed me the key, his disinterest both comforting and unsettling. My room was sparse but clean, and I bolted the door the moment I entered. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old building set my nerves on edge. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping on the window. My heart stopped. I lay frozen, listening. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. No one was there, but the glass bore smudged fingerprints, as if someone had pressed their hands against it. I backed away from the window, clutching my phone. The signal was weak, but I managed to call the front desk. The clerk sounded groggy, but promised to send someone up to check. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, knife in hand. When the knock finally came, I nearly screamed. It was the clerk, accompanied by a security guard. They checked the window but found nothing. "Probably just a prank," the clerk said dismissively. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I left at first light, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and Redstone. As I drove, the paranoia lingered. Every car that passed seemed suspicious, every roadside shadow a potential threat. I couldn't tell if the hitchhiker was still following me or if my mind was playing tricks. About an hour later, I stopped at a diner for breakfast. It was crowded, the noise and bustle a stark contrast to the isolation I'd felt the night before. For the first time in hours, I began to relax. I was halfway through my meal when a waitress approached, her expression puzzled. "Someone left this for you," she said, handing me an envelope. My stomach churned as I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Written in sharp, precise handwriting were 3 words: "See you soon." I dropped the note as if it had burned me, my appetite vanishing. How had he found me? I paid quickly and left the diner, my hands trembling. The sense of safety I'd felt was gone, replaced by a suffocating dread. I couldn't escape him. He was always one step ahead. The drive to Colorado became a blur of fear and exhaustion. I finally arrived at my friend's house, his warm greeting a small comfort. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd had a strange encounter on the road. He laughed it off, but I couldn't join him. That night, as I lay in the guest room, I stared at the locked door, wondering if it would be enough to keep the hitchhiker out. Days turned into weeks, and I began to feel safe again. My friend's house was in a busy neighborhood, surrounded by people and activity. I convinced myself that the hitchhiker had given up, that he was just some drifter playing mind games. But the anxiety lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Every time the phone rang or the doorbell chimed, my heart raced, expecting the worst. One evening, I decided to walk to the corner store to clear my head. The streets were quiet, the sky streaked with the orange and pink of twilight. As I rounded the corner, I froze. Parked at the curb was a familiar car. It was unmistakable. The old beat-up sedan the hitchhiker had been standing near at the gas station. My heart dropped. He had found me. I turned and walked quickly back to the house, resisting the urge to run. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached the door, fumbling with the keys. Once inside, I locked every door and window, my hands trembling. My friend found me pacing the living room, a knife in hand. "What's going on?" he asked, alarmed. I told him everything, the words spilling out in a frantic rush. He listened, his expression shifting from concern to disbelief. "Are you sure you're not imagining this?" he asked gently. "You've been under a lot of stress." His doubt stung, but I couldn't blame him. Even I wasn't sure what was real anymore. That night, he stayed up with me, watching movies to distract me. But my thoughts were elsewhere, fixated on the hitchhiker and his cryptic message. "See you soon." The next morning, my friend convinced me to report everything to the local police. I recounted the events for what felt like the 100th time, but the officer was sympathetic and promised to increase patrols in the area. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that this nightmare might finally end. I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. That evening, I went to bed early, exhaustion weighing on me like a lead blanket. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My heart leapt as I grabbed the knife from my nightstand. I crept to the living room, every step measured in silence. The room was dark, but I could make out a figure crouched near the broken window. It was him. The hitchhiker had come for me. Adrenaline surged through me as I stepped forward, the knife shaking in my grip. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice cracking. He straightened, his face illuminated by the moonlight. His expression was calm, almost serene. "You can't stop me," he said, his tone chillingly confident. He moved toward me, and I lunged, slashing wildly. The blade caught his arm, and he stumbled back, clutching the wound. I bolted for the door, screaming for my friend. He burst out of his room, a baseball bat in hand. Together, we confronted the hitchhiker, who was now visibly shaken. He hesitated, glancing between us before retreating through the broken window. My friend chased him into the yard, but he was gone by the time we reached the street. The police arrived minutes later, but there was no sign of him. The officers searched the area and took our statements, assuring us they would investigate. I could tell they were skeptical, but they didn't dismiss us outright. The next morning, I packed my things and left, unable to stay in Colorado any longer. My friend understood, though the sadness in his eyes was evident. "Take care of yourself," he said as we hugged by. I promised I would, but the truth was, I didn't know how. Months have passed, and I've started to rebuild my life. I moved to a new city, changed my phone number, and adopted a dog for protection. The hitchhiker hasn't resurfaced, but I can't shake the fear that he's still out there, watching and waiting. Every time I see an unfamiliar car or pass a stranger on the street, I wonder if it's him. I survived, but I'll never truly feel safe again. Next story. I'd rented the cabin for peace and quiet. After months of nonstop work in the city, I needed a break, somewhere remote. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. No cell signal, no neighbors, just me, a pile of books, and my laptop for the occasional email. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first 2 days passed without incident. I hiked during the day and read by the fireplace at night. The woods were eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. I didn't mind. The isolation was calming, almost therapeutic. But on the third night, something changed. I was halfway through a novel when I heard a faint voice calling from the woods. "Hello?" It was distant but unmistakable, a man's voice. I froze, straining to hear. "Hello? Anyone there?" It called again, slightly louder. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, scanning the dark tree line. "Who's there?" I shouted, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no response. Just the steady hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the wind or my imagination, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been an animal. Coyotes, maybe. Their howls could sometimes sound human, but the explanation felt hollow. I avoided the woods that day, sticking close to the cabin. The voice haunted me, replaying in my mind with every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked before settling in with a book. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Then, just as I began to relax, the voice returned. "Hello?" It was closer this time, clearer. My breath caught in my throat as the voice repeated, "Hello? Is someone there?" I didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the lights and peered through the curtains. The woods were pitch black, the trees swaying in the wind. I gripped the edge of the windowsill, my palms sweating. The voice called again, but this time, it didn't sound like a question. "Hello," it said flatly, as if it already knew I was there. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, clutching a kitchen knife. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. The crack of a branch, the hoot of an owl. I kept telling myself it was just a prank, maybe some local kids messing with the city guy. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, but as I stepped outside, I stopped. Something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Then I saw them footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They weren't mine. They were too large, too wide. My chest tightened as I realized they led directly into the woods. I followed the footprints for a few steps before stopping myself. What was I doing? Whoever or whatever had been outside the cabin wasn't someone I wanted to meet. I hurried back inside, locking the door and pushing a chair under the handle. My plan to leave would have to wait until daylight. That night, the voice came again, closer than ever. "Hello," it called, right outside the cabin. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was coming from the front porch. The doorknob rattled, followed by a slow, deliberate knock. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The knocking stopped, but the voice returned, louder. "Let me in." I stayed frozen for hours, clutching the knife until my hand cramped. The voice didn't come back, but I knew it was still out there. When dawn broke, I finally summoned the courage to check the porch. The footprints were back, deep and fresh, leading from the woods to the door and back again. Whoever it was had been watching me all night. I decided to leave immediately. I threw my bags into the car and started the engine. But as I turned onto the narrow dirt road, my tires screeched to a halt. A figure stood in the middle of the road, blocking my path. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. I honked the horn, but he didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving. I reversed the car, my hands shaking, and sped back to the cabin. My escape would have to wait. Back inside, I locked every door and window again, wondering how long I could stay hidden. The woods felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. The hours dragged by in suffocating silence. Then, as dusk fell, the voice returned. "Hello," it said, but this time it was coming from inside the cabin. My stomach dropped as I realized the voice was coming from the back room. I grabbed the knife and crept toward the sound, my heart pounding. The back room was empty, but the window was wide open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. I slammed it shut, bolting it tight. Then I noticed something on the floor, muddy footprints leading from the window to the door. The voice echoed through the cabin again, impossibly close. "I see you." I ran outside, desperate to escape. But as I reached the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written in the dirt on the driver's side window were two words: nitrogen monoxide escape. I stumbled back, my mind racing. The voice came again, louder than ever, reverberating through the trees. "You can't leave." I fled into the woods, hoping to lose whoever or whatever was tormenting me. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my skin. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a small clearing. For a moment, all was silent. Then the voice came again, directly behind me. "Hello." I turned, but there was no one there. Just the trees and the oppressive darkness. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, my lungs burning. I didn't know where I was going, just away. But no matter how far I ran, the voice followed, always calling, always closer. Finally, I saw it, the faint glow of headlights through the trees. A road. Summoning the last of my strength, I stumbled toward it. A passing truck screeched to a halt as I burst from the woods, waving frantically. The driver, an older man, helped me into the cab. "What happened?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I just kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him. The truck driver took me to the nearest town, where I contacted the local police. They searched the cabin and the surrounding woods, but found nothing, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. The officer looked at me with pity. "You were probably just hearing things," he said. "Isolation can mess with your head." But I knew what I'd heard. The voice wasn't in my head. It was real, and it had followed me into the woods. Even now, safe in my apartment miles away from that cabin, I still hear it sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it whispering from the shadows.